welcome everyone for another episode of Thinking Historically About. And in this episode, we're going to think historically about the concept of freedom, at least in the first 100 or so years of American history. And to help us think about this concept, we have Dr. Adam Seagrave, an associate professor of civic and economic thought and leadership at Arizona State University. Dr. Seagrave, thank you so much for joining us today. To give our students a sense of kind of how you approach the ideas of this unit, and I'd love to just kind of start off and hear more about what got you into this particular area of study and what maybe your current research focuses on.
Yeah, so I study American political thought and history with a focus on early American history, the Revolutionary and founding eras, and going up through the Civil War. And I have a particular focus on issues of race in American history from the Revolutionary era up to the present. And in that focus, especially on issues of race, the idea of freedom becomes extremely important and central. And that was really one of the main things that drew me both to the focus on the American founding era and also to a focus on racial issues in American history, was that there's a kind of moral or normative side to American political development that is strong throughout, and there's of course this massive disparity between the ideals that America has been built upon from the beginning and the practices that we've engaged in, both individual Americans and the American government, the United States government, throughout our history and in our founding documents. So that really is what drew me to study this topic. I think it's really, really important. I think the United States has always stood as a kind of symbol of freedom, of equality, of justice to the world. But at the same time, we've also served as particularly egregious examples at times of how we can fail to live up to those ideals. So all of that, I think, is really important, both for us as Americans, and then also for human beings generally, to try to figure out how we can make more just, more free, more equal societies.
I really appreciate kind of that juxtaposition of ideals and the goal of living up to those ideals, sometimes the failure towards that goal. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of how you see that play out in American history, what the scholarship shows around the ideas, of the founding and how those develop over time. And to do that, I'm going to pose the prompt that students are engaging with and ask you to kind of think through that prompt. So students are asked the question in this unit: how did the meaning of freedom develop in America from its founding through the Civil War? And so, if you'd be, if you kind of help us think through that based on what you just said, how might we approach a question like that?
Yeah. So, well, I think first of all, of course, it's a complex story of how the meaning of freedom has developed. And I think that framing it in terms of that historical thinking concept of continuity and change over time, what has stayed the same during the period of time we're looking at, and what has changed. I think identifying that carefully is really important. I think that sometimes what has changed, I think, is in some ways more clear than what has stayed the same, in that we can see from the time of the founding and the Constitution through the time of the Civil War, we can see a clear development in terms of expansion of the people to whom those ideas of freedom have applied, particularly enslaved African Americans. By the end of the Civil War, there's a more complete, obviously not sufficient in any way, but a more complete application of the idea of freedom to African Americans at the end of the Civil War and then the Civil War amendments. So that change is a very dramatic one and it's very important. But one thing, too, that I think we tend to overlook when we're looking at that historical development around freedom is the continuity aspect, or the way in which some of the same contradictions that we grapple with today and that they were grappling with in the Civil War over how freedom should apply to African Americans, that contradiction was a very clear one even at the time of the founding, from the beginning and from the time of the Revolution. So you have Thomas Jefferson has a draft of the Declaration of Independence where he condemns slavery. That part of his draft is taken out before the final version of the Declaration of Independence. So people like Jefferson himself see that there's a clear contradiction between the freedom that the colonists, the white colonists, are fighting for, and the freedom that's being denied to enslaved African Americans. Jefferson sees there's a contradiction there at the time of the Declaration of Independence. Prince Hall, a free African American in Massachusetts, points that out very clearly immediately after the Declaration of Independence, that this idea of freedom that is present in that document applies even more strongly and clearly to the case of African American enslavement. And so there were certainly some people at the time of the founding, many who did not see a contradiction between those ideals of freedom and the practice of slavery, but there were also many who did, and some of the leading founders like Jefferson who did see a contradiction there. So it's important to identify the nature of the change over time, and that change over time from the founding to the Civil War is less about a new realization about the idea of freedom, and more about a new moral stance towards how that ideal should be put into practice. So that's kind of the level of development over time, and so I think it's a complicated story, but and it's one that does have that element of continuity where the application over time does build upon the idea of freedom that's present in the revolutionary and founding eras.
One thing that I heard is, well, first there's this moral component to freedom, and the imperative, this moral imperative, seemed to grow over time to apply this definition of freedom to more Americans. So my first question is, what is that definition of freedom? Like, what does that look like in practicality for American citizens? And then the historian's question that, I think we'll see in student responses as they, write their own essays around this question, is what is the historian's role in understanding and talking about these moral implications of the past and kind of making, because in essence, by, I think, being excited as a human about this expansion of freedom is making a moral claim that this is a good thing. And so what's the role of the scholar in that?
Thanks. Those are great questions. I think that in terms of what the definition of freedom is, that is something that has changed over time and developed certainly over time, but again, in ways that are still recognizably connected to the earlier ways of thinking about freedom, at least oftentimes. So in the case of the period that we're looking at from the founding through the Civil War, freedom is defined in the Declaration of Independence in terms of basic human rights. So, and as the Declaration terms them, unalienable rights that people are created with or born with. And the Declaration lists a few of those basic rights, and of course there may be others. It's not necessarily exhaustive. And then, to some extent, the historical development that comes afterward, starting immediately, really, and of course at the moment of the Constitution writing 10, 11 years later, and then thereafter, the historical question is then, what are the implications of that basic idea of freedom in political practice? And so that's where you get the historical development over time. And of course, that occurs in conjunction with people fighting for freedoms that they've been denied. So in the American context, both of those happen together and in collaboration with one another. So in other societies and other times in history, you have groups of people who are denied certain rights, like the right to vote, or the right to speak freely, the right to publish things, the right to protest, things like that, to participate in the political process, and people fight for those rights and may be granted them if they have sufficient power to force the granting of those rights. In the American context, that drive to enforce the granting of rights or the recognition of rights by the government is paired with the ideals that are enunciated in early American history, and the Declaration is the most obvious place. The ideals about freedom that are clearly stated there. So you have people like the authors of the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, right? Stanton and Lucretia Mott and others who rewrite the Declaration of Independence in such a way that it makes clear that certain rights should be granted to women because of the rights that are in the Declaration of Independence. And then you have Frederick Douglass arguing that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution actually point to or should guarantee certain rights to African Americans. So in the American context, that fight for freedom and increasing freedom over time, it uses those ideals, those early American ideals, as ammunition, if you will, or as a weapon, or as a moral force to draw upon to try to hold people in power accountable and to try to bring political reality more in line with those ideals. So there's that kind of moral dimension in American historical development that's particularly pronounced, that joins with the practical dimension of people fighting for their freedom. So yeah, so in terms of the definition of freedom, it changes and expands over time to include those applications, additional applications, but then its core, I think, oftentimes remains the same, that it's centered on certain basic human rights. So the historian's role in understanding that, and the moral implications, I think as historians, we're not always or necessarily concerned with normative and moral claims, right? We're not about moralizing when we study history. We're about studying what actually happened. But in the American context, and especially in the time we're discussing here, those two things join together. So it's hard to understand the struggles for freedom of African Americans before the Civil War, or of women for equal rights. It's hard to understand those struggles without taking seriously the moral applications of those American ideals, right? So in the Declaration of Independence.
What I appreciate and kind of is very evident, and even in like the documents the students are looking at, you'll see the Declaration of Independence with Prince Hall's petition to the Massachusetts legislature. Both talk about inalienable rights, list them. The Declaration of Sentiments is, purposely crafted in the language of the Declaration of Independence. What to the Slave is the 4th of July by Frederick Douglass, addresses the goodness, the inherent goodness in the language of the Declaration of Independence. And then, Douglass so eloquently calls out the hypocrisy of the lived kind of reality about those ideals. But, and it's probably not this isn't the place to explore that, at least this unit. But, even students can think like, okay, so what are these ideals? What do these rights? What do these freedoms look like today? What does this mean in the 21st century? How might that differ from the context of Stanton and Douglas? How might it still be the same? Now, I mentioned the documents that the students are looking at. When you're thinking about freedom in the 19th century, are there particular documents or people that stand out to you that maybe students aren't exposed to when they're engaging in this unit?
Yes. So I think there's another very important document on this topic that's closely related to the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason, which was influential on the Declaration of Independence itself, written at about the same time, just a month or so before. So the Virginia Declaration of Rights from 1776, I think, is really important. I would also read, for example, Phyllis Wheatley's poetry. I think is another important source of thinking about freedom. Sojourner Truth and her great speech really profoundly touches on ideas of freedom as they relate both to women and to African Americans. So I think that's very important document. William Lloyd Garrison, another abolitionist who works closely with Frederick Douglass, especially for a period of time on the cause of abolition. He also has some unique but important reflections on freedom that are worth reading. I would also, of course, point to Abraham Lincoln's
Yeah.
speeches. His speeches are very eloquent and important on this topic. His speech, I know there are many, but his speech on the Dred Scott decision is an excellent, I think, excellent place to start in understanding how Lincoln saw the connection between the Declaration of Independence and the case of African American enslavement. I think he clearly explains what that connection is. So those are a few that I would point to, and of course there are many others.
Sure. I'm going to bring William Lloyd Garrison into this next question. But this unit, it asks a very broad question. But I think if we're being practical about the documents students are analyzing, they're set up to view that question in a particular way, right? The development of freedom. We see that there's this core ideal. I mean, the Declaration, in some capacity, is cited in three of the four documents, right? So it's definitely demonstrating that continuity. But there's other ways to think about freedom and the development of freedom. And so I'm curious, like, what are both scholarly examples of other approaches to this question that maybe don't look at a kind of moral definition expanding its application over time? There may be something completely new. And I think, and I'm bringing Garrison here because at one point, and this is where Frederick Douglass and Garrison, to get a little bit into the weeds, part in the 1850s, is Garrison kind of says, let's burn the Constitution. To me, that's a perspective that says, hey, the ideals of the Constitution aren't inherently good. They aren't inherently about freedom, and it needs to be rewritten. And I think that, like, there's plenty of Americans who feel like Garrison to today even. So I'm just curious, and that doesn't have to be the perspective you talk about, but I would just love to hear, like, how might there be another approach to this question?
Yes, yeah, I think that's a great point. I think those are really really important points. Yeah, and I think that's right, absolutely right, in terms of Garrison and yeah, how he saw the Constitution. And Garrison's an interesting case because he agrees with the Declaration of Independence and thinks that the Declaration of Independence is a force for freedom, but that the Constitution essentially reversed course on that, and doubled down on slavery. And yeah, there are other examples as well. Certainly, I can think of Nat Turner's rebellion, attempts by enslaved people themselves to fight directly and violently for their freedom. And so those are certainly very important and sometimes effective ways of fighting for freedom that are not necessarily connected with founding documents or with moral ideals, because yeah, we're human beings. Enslaved African Americans were human beings who felt very strongly the oppression of being denied their freedom and fought to get it back. And that's something actually that terrified Jefferson himself, because he realized that this was something that he couldn't stop this innate human desire for freedom that was showing itself in these rebellions of enslaved people. So there's that. There's John Brown is another good example of this, of someone who tried to fight for freedom outside of the confines of the American political order and American founding documents. I think he had respect for the Declaration of Independence and to some extent the Constitution as well, but he thought that freedom was itself was more important as a actually religious imperative for him. So yeah, so I think that there are other very important examples of fighting for freedom, also apart from those ones that do use American ideals. And of course, you can also point to Harriet Tubman and to all the efforts of those involved in the Underground Railroad, as ways of more practical, perhaps directly practical ways of fighting for freedom. And increasing freedom. So that there are also other expressions of political freedom that are important, that are developing during this time, like the extension of the right to vote beyond white male landholders to all white males, which of course now we think of that as certainly still restrictive, but that's an extension of freedom beyond what was around at the beginning. So that's another dimension of the development of freedom during this period of time. It does lay the groundwork for some of these later developments, extensions of the right to vote to non-white males and women, of course, as well. So,
what I kind of, as just kind of listening to your examples, I think maybe those who engage in scholarship, we tend to live in a disembodied world at times, but the people we study were very much embodied. And so like if you think like, you read the speeches of Frederick Douglass and you read the speeches of Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and like you get caught up in their ideals. Especially I think of the Sojourner Truth speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" Like you think of, wow, that's such an impactful rhetorical masterpiece. And yet every day these people were fighting for embodied freedom, for the freedom to go do something, to be with a group, to experience something. And yeah, I appreciate your reminder of, slave resistance as a whole. And, just a plug for you students, have your teachers explore slave resistance in one of our other units and engage with Nat Turner and engage with running away and how that's a form of resistance. And but what those are examples of is like it's what you and I do every day with our families and our communities, that it's maybe informed by these abstract ideals, but they're lived out in a very particular embodied way that sometimes can get lost in the documents.
absolutely, yeah. I think that's a great reminder, and yeah, whenever we study history, it's just to remind ourselves that yeah, these were people who were living lives just as we're living lives right now. It wasn't the past for them; it was the present, and to realize that even though we have obviously we have distance from them in terms of time, and if we're studying documents and people, we want to have a certain objectivity, not be biased toward about them. But I think it is really important to always remind ourselves about that they're embodied individuals who are living their lives, and they're not only living the moments that we see today and reflect upon today. They're living a lot of moments in between that are very, very important, and there's a context to all of the particular moments that we're picking out and abstracting from the history. So yeah, I think that's really important. And it's one thing that certainly to try to get in their shoes. I think that's, we should try to do that, to see their writings and speeches as they would have seen them themselves. We can't completely do that, but I think you're right. It's important to not be overly abstract and to remind ourselves that these are real people who were living in their present. It wasn't the past for them.
Yeah, I think more than anyone, I was probably preaching to myself on that one. Just kind of reminding that,
Oh,
yeah,
we need a reminder of that. Yeah.
I often say to students, that the primary job in studying history is to understand people from a time and place, not like your own. And part of understanding is yes, understanding what shapes their actions, but also recognizing like they also wanted to eat 3 meals a day. They needed water, like they needed community. And yeah,
I was
go
going to
ahead.
say, sorry for cutting you off. Yeah, and they were human beings like we are. You know, their world was different in many ways, but they also, as you were saying, have some of the very same needs and concerns and wants and desires that we have today, and similar behavior. And yeah, so I think it's important to remember that.
And I think that's where the continuity of the concept of freedom is helpful, right? Like this is what freedom means as I am exposed to, different perspectives, different worldviews, different lived experiences, I then can realize, huh, yeah, maybe I'm not applying that definition of freedom to this other perspective or these other lived experiences. And I think the same thing can happen in our study of the past. One thing I continue to impress is that if I'm left with simple answers in my study of the past, I'm probably doing it wrong. And so what I appreciate about everything you brought to the table is you've complicated the story. And I think that's really important for us to just remember that human beings are complex people, and the anecdotes are maybe not statistically um, kind of trackable, but they're valuable. They give us a sense into people's thinking in a particular moment. It just reminds me that like the more we embody the past, I think the more complicated it gets, and that's a good thing, and it gives us a lot to wrestle with. In that vein, because that was me kind of expressing where my hope is, but I'm curious, like if you have your students engage with a question like this, looking at freedom in this particular era, what's a goal that you have? What do you want to see your students wrestle with, take away from, and study?
Yeah, I think I completely agree. First of all, with what you just said about the importance of complicating history, understanding it in its complexity rather than oversimplifying for the
Right.
purpose of making it easy. Because I think that is probably the biggest mistake that we can make in studying history or in developing historical narratives is oversimplifying it. From our own perspective, that's a problem, but then also just oversimplifying it. So I think that, yeah, that's a really good point. So what would I want my students to take away from studying freedom during this period of time? I think one would be achieving a greater understanding of freedom as it applies to our own time and to themselves. I think that's important because I think freedom is a very complex concept. I think there are consequences, practically speaking, to how we understand our freedom, and that's both on an individual level and on a social and political level. There are consequences to that. So I think that the opportunity to expand and deepen the understanding that we have of our own freedom and of freedom today, I think is really important. And I think part of that is helping students to understand the overlap or certain continuities between the way that people understood freedom at this time and the way we understand it today. So
Mm-hmm.
again, realizing that this was a historical context different from our own in many important ways, but that there are ways in which their understanding of freedom might be similar to our understanding of freedom, or ways in which they understood freedom that would be beneficial for us to add to our understanding of freedom or supplement it or elaborate on it. So I think that's important too, to not study freedom, that concept or others as well in these time periods as completely alien from us or as completely obsolete. I
Sure.
don't think that freedom in that time period is obsolete for us now. I think it's still relevant. So that's another goal is to understand that relevance and then also to draw connections between the way in which people understood and fought for freedom at this time to the way in which people understand and fight for freedom today. There are those connections, they run throughout, that we are living in a political community that has developed continuously from the founding era to today, at least more or less continuously, obviously with some important gaps, or not gaps, but interruptions like the Civil War, for example, along the way. But there's a historical continuity, which means that we can't escape that history. So even if we wanted to try to ignore or downplay or reject some of our understandings that were around at that time, we can't separate ourselves from that entirely because of that historical continuity. So I think those are a few things that I would want to try to encourage students to get from studying this concept of freedom during this time period.
I mean, I'm left with so much more to think about, but for the sake of time, just thank you so much for engaging in the conversation and for giving us a lot to think about. Dr. Adam Seagrave, your scholarship is super helpful. Your insights to this unit, I think, are going to be really helpful for students, and so we appreciate your time investing in this project.
Thanks so much, Zach. Thanks for the opportunity.